Wow. Good day, everyone. I don't know about you, but that music got me pumping, and I think I need a copy of that because as a drummer, I love having percussion right there in the front. Well, good day to you all, and welcome to this edition of Expert Insights. Our speaker today is interesting. As I read his bio and as we've had conversations, I think you're going to agree he's got the measures of success that we all look for. And yet he's taken a very non-linear path to getting there. I see him nodding. And I think for me, it's very reminiscent of what Bruce Feller, the author of Council of Dads, writes about in his book called Life in the Transitions. And it's something I think we can all take lesson from as well as pay attention to, because I think it's becoming more and more the case. So here's what I'm talking about. Jabez Labret was homeless in high school, dropped out, and was on a path, in his own words, to nowhere. However, he got his GED, he went to Gonzaga University, he started his own businesses. He's now done over 1,200 presentations like this. He's a multi-time best-selling author with his newest book, as you're here to find out, called I Don't Match Socks, coming out in the fall of 2022. He also is a Forbes contributor and sold a very, very successful and award-winning marketing agency in 2017. So we've got a lot of expertise to draw on here. I won't delay us getting to that. I just want to mention just a couple more things, just kind of put things in perspective. We really are excited to have this conversation today because we all know that we're in a time of political drama, polarization. We have the challenges of hybrid work environments. We're all trying to manage in, I think, more than ever, multi-generational workforces. And all of this is kind of gotten fuel poured on the fire during the pandemic, right? So how do we navigate through that as leaders? So the four things that we hope that we're going to give you to walk away with today are: one, how to increase retention and productivity by understanding what each of those generations is really motivated by, what they want from their work, right? The other three are tactics for how you as a leader can impact your team to produce that outcome. Third is strategies for building a strong post-COVID culture. And I think we'd all be missing the boat if we didn't admit that culture is shifting. And we, as conscious business leaders, want to get intentionally ahead of that. Fourth, what generation is, this is a question that we're hoping we're going to be able to answer for you, is what generation is begging to come to the office and which ones don't want to have any part of it, right? And how do we navigate all of that as well? So without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce you to Jabez Labret. I do want to let you know that Jabez's preference is as you have questions come up, you can put them in the comment area, and we don't have any way for it to go live to you directly, but if you'll put them in the comment area, I will share those questions with Jabez and we'll answer them in time. Okay. All right, Jabez, please.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at in the world. Just really excited to be here today and get a chance to just kind of have a conversation about some of the massive changes that we've seen, really, as John mentioned, accelerated due to COVID, and, how are we going to navigate these moments? Interestingly, the Washington Post just had an article come out, or Wall Street Journal just had an article come out yesterday about friendships at work. And are friendships at work important or not? We're going to actually be covering some interesting topics around friendships at work. what does the work dynamic mean? John hit it right on the head, where we're kidding ourselves if we don't think there's been some sort of a culture shift within our organizations. And a lot of that is due to the fact that, we put so much work into building culture, and then we let the culture kind of germinate and grow. But sometimes massive external factors can push on us. And it's time to maybe hit the reset button and realign what exactly it is that we're talking about with regards to culture. So we're going to jump right in. We've got lots of things to talk about today. I'm going to go fairly fast through things. We're going to be talking about tactics. We're going to be talking about strategies, and we're going to be talking about just vision and mindset. So we're going to wrap it all into 1 hour. And there's going to be time for questions after. But as John mentioned, please don't hesitate to drop questions into the chat as we go. Let's talk a little bit about kind of where we're at as leaders, and what is our role as a leader? What is our job as a leader? This is an important time to level set hey, buddy, come here. And this is part of the life that we're dealing with. Come here. Okay, all right. So this is the world that we're in. We are in the world where this happens on the regular. And this has been a new experience for most of us in the workplace, because normally we don't get to take our kids to work. So can you say goodbye to everybody and then go back outside?
Goodbye.
Okay, thank you.
Oh my gosh.
Let go, buddy. Oh my goodness. All right. Little guest appearance. I should have just had him finish the talk. So back to where we are as leaders. We are having to adapt a lot, as are our employees, obviously, and our team members, having to make a lot of changes and adaptations. We were just talking yesterday about what it meant to have our kids out of school, and having to parent at home with kids, doing Zoom school and trying to just manage your job. And those gap moments had a big impact on kind of how we're approaching work today. So when it comes down to our mindset as leaders, it is our job and our role as leaders to make adjustments and changes to the way that we lead and manage to optimize our team and organization's performance. It is our job to identify where we need to improve and the changes that we need to make in order to set our team up for the most success possible. If we are doing our job, our team is equipped, prepared, ready, and feels emotionally prepared to go into battle and to win. And so one thing I want you to do right now, while you're sitting at your desk, or you're if you're driving, don't do this. But if you're sitting down or you're at your coffee table, write down just a few words to describe what you think would make for a good employee. Just some characteristics. Just thinking out loud about things like punctuality, or you might put work ethic, but think to yourself, what does that mean? Like, what does work ethic to you mean? And think about some of those characteristics that you might define as what would make for a good employee. And I'm not talking about the highest echelon, A-est of A players. We all know those are rare. We all know that those are wonderful. Those kind of employees are great, but they are few and far between. And generally speaking, those employees are already on a track up and out anyway. They're already heading into some pretty incredible places. So let's just take a half a second to think about some of these characteristics that make for a really, really good employee. On that list, what you are looking at right now is likely how you viewed yourself when you were a younger employee. Generally speaking, when we do this exercise, and if we were all in person, which I know we love being in person, but sometimes we got to do this online version of this. Sometimes what you write down here is a reflection, but not a reflection of where you are today, because you've put in a lot of work to grow and change and become the leader that you are today. But oftentimes when we think about what does a good team member make, we write down a list of attributes and characteristics that we had when we were younger. And so when I think back to my younger self, and I'd gone through some stuff in life, but I kind of come out the other side, and I got my very first job. And I remember I showed up early. I left late. I took on every project that I was given. I was hungry, and I really, really wanted to invest and grow. Now, I might be a little different breed because, obviously not everybody's an entrepreneur or really is the kind of person who wants to go on and I guess it's take on the challenge of growing a company. And sometimes you wonder why you do that. So for those of you that are founders, you're like, yeah, I've had that moment where I was like, why am I doing this? This is ridiculous. But I think we've all been there. We've all experienced that, we hunkered down, put in the work, and really learned to grow. And so I want to talk a little bit about what maybe got those characteristics there, and let's define what some of these different generations are so that we can understand kind of a baseline, a point of where we are when it comes to what's going on inside the workplace and the dynamics of these employees. So what we have right here is the best way I could pull together one single slide that will encapsulate all of the generations and help us begin to dissect who, how, and what they got there. On the left-hand side, we're seeing some major things that happened inside the generational timeline here that had a major impact on the generation. The reason those are important is that question of what defines a generation, like what makes a generation. Why are baby boomers baby boomers? Like why are Gen X Gen X? That definition, it's not only defined by time, there's a timeline, but it's also defined by events that occur within that timeline period. And so major events can cause shifts in generations for sure. And so we see those play a role. On the bottom, we're seeing kind of the growth of what was happening in technology and what was maybe happening within the way that we communicate and what's happening in the way that we interact and what's available to us along the timeline. And so I want to walk through each one of these one by one here so that we can begin to get a really good understanding and baseline of where each generation is coming from. So the baby boomers, anytime you're talking about a generation and you're talking about what goes into that generation, it is a complex mix of their parents.
Hey, Jabez. Sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing the slides. And unfortunately,
well, that makes it really difficult, doesn't it? Because I just told you all of the awesome things that you were seeing on the slides that you were not seeing, that you hopefully are now seeing.
There we go.
There we go. All right, so let's go into, again, left side is major things that might have impacted the generation. Bottom side is technology and communication. And then we're going to go through each one of these step by step. Good thing is this isn't not an overly complicated slide. So baby boomers. So we're talking about parents' influence. We're talking about the way that society is functioning. So things are happening within the society that you're growing up in, and then external things that might be happening around the globe that can have an impact on that person growing up. And oftentimes what creates or codifies a generation is their life between 0 and 18. And even you could say less than 18, but we kind of go ahead and go 0 to 18 is what kind of builds that generation's characteristics and attributes. Understand not every person in a generation is going to act the way that their generation's characteristics are. We're going to be talking in some stereotypes and generalizations here, but it's going to help us start to kind of understand and unpack what might be happening. And so for baby boomers, their parents oftentimes might have gone through the Depression. Their parents certainly went through World War I and World War II. And so we're talking, or certainly went through World War II. Some of them might have gone through World War I. We're talking about a generation, that silent generation, which are the baby boomers' parents, who were raised in an environment where if you had an opportunity to have a good job, you were so dedicated and loyal to that opportunity that you would never quit your job. The company was loyal to you. They would hopefully not lay you off. Certainly after the Depression, we saw a lot less of that happening. And what we have here is a generation that was raised by parents who were thrifty, who believed in saving, who believed in wasting not, who believed in a separation within the home of where traditionally the husband had gone to work and the wife had stayed home until the world wars broke out. And then we saw a movement, particularly in World War II, where women entered in the workforce in masses that had never been seen before. And so what we have here is the boomers were raised out of that generation of parent. The baby boomers experienced Vietnam. They experienced the hippie movement. They were the ones who built what is today modern corporate culture. The baby boomers were a little bit rebellious. They believed in blazing their own path. They believed in winning. Getting to the top of the mountain was important to baby boomers. And they really were out there trailblazing in many, many, many ways. And they started to see in an increase in things that made life a lot easier from a technology perspective. Credit cards came out in 1950. IBM was really starting to produce a lot of different kinds of computers for different applications by 1965. And so we're starting to see things just become a little bit easier from a technology perspective, but we're still really not there yet. Gen X is the next generation. They are the smallest generation of all the generations listed here by number. The Gen Xers are interesting. So Gen Xers were born of the Cold War. Their parents were the rebellious trailblazers who now are in corporate jobs and are now earning a living, saving money, buying their first home, having one or two children. They're the latchkey generation. So their parents often both worked, which meant they had a lot more resources, right? So if you can imagine a home where both parents are working, resources in the sense of money, you end up with a lot more income. And the Gen Xers were kind of given the opportunity to explore, right? So technology was really starting to ramp up. Pagers came out in the early 80s. By the mid 90s, we saw cell phones were becoming ubiquitous. Everybody was pretty much starting to get a cell phone, at least in the professional sense. Maybe not, definitely not the kids yet. I remember when cell phones were still like $1 a minute, which it's just like how short your phone calls would have to be, just because you didn't want to pay too much to have that phone call. But Gen X really grew up in a generation where technology was starting to become a lot more prevalent and a lot more important in everyday life. And they were given a chance to explore. Gen Xers, interestingly, they're all about the journey. And there's that saying that's like, it's not about reaching the top, it's about the journey along the way. That's a very Gen X born type of philosophy. The whole idea of self-help industry, while it may have kind of been rooted in the hippie movement, it morphed into something new. And the whole journey exploration nature of Gen X really made them reflective and really made them thoughtful about who am I and what's my place here and what is this journey that I'm on. Gen Xers watched technology go through a massive shift. And that massive shift was when the internet started to become something that we all had access to. The internet's been around for a long time, but it wasn't accessible. And Gen X really was the first generation to see that become something, to see the internet find its way into our lives. And then we end up with the millennials being born around 1980. Millennials were the first generation to grow up with the internet, to grow up with mobile phones as a thing that is around. The millennials, oftentimes we hear things about millennials like, oh, they're entitled. They're the trophy generation. I always think it's interesting. The millennials weren't buying their own trophies. Like that was the parents were buying the trophies for the Little League team, to give out the participation trophy, but they did receive a trophy. When I grew up, I played baseball and some other sports, and I had a shrine of trophies that were 99% participation trophies, in my room. And so, yes, we grew up with a ton of trophies and access to information and communication modes that didn't exist before. We also grew up in a new educational type of shift. So in K-12, there was a big shift in the 80s and moving into the 90s where they started to move towards group training in school. And so they started to do a lot more group activities and a lot less individual driven learning. And that's going to be important when it comes to what we're kind of going to start talking about understanding these generations and how they want to function at work. And so the millennials were really this first generation to fully be immersed in the idea of group learning as opposed to individual learning. Millennials were also the generation where the millennials' parents really wanted to involve the millennial in learning about life in maybe a unique way that their parents hadn't. And that was in the form of letting the millennial ask a lot of questions, share their opinion often, and really be a part. I remember my parents were looking for a new house and they asked me where we should move. And I was like 9 years old, not because I was going to get to choose where we moved to, but because they wanted to have the conversation about what do you think about what kind of schools are there? Are there parks nearby? And they were just using it as a teaching moment, and that's fine and not a problem. But if you add all those moments up, I'm getting an opportunity to share my opinion on everything. Not because my opinion is necessarily the one followed, but that's not the point. The point is I'm getting to share my opinion. Where this manifests itself at work is when you have that millennial employee that you hired 10 years ago, maybe, and they began giving you like unsolicited advice or opinions about how things should go 2 weeks into the presentation or 2 weeks into their employment. And you're like, you just started here. Like, what, how could, like, thank you, but like, okay, hold on. And so that was just because that's how the millennials were raised. And then we move into Gen Z. And Gen Z, keep in mind, your millennials now some of them are in their 40s. And so the millennials aren't the newest in the workplace anymore. They're not your youngest employees. They're often moving into your management roles. And so millennials, we've begun to learn how to work with millennials, but there's been some interesting shifts in post-COVID with millennials that are separate from some of the other generations. Generation Z, millennials on steroids. I mean, I don't know how else to really put it. They had pretty much everything the millennials had plus. Social media was ubiquitous for Gen Z from the get-go. They were born with pretty much social media being a thing. Like, shares, comments, instant gratification, serotonin and dopamine out the gazoo through their interaction with the internet. Whether that's healthy or bad, I don't know, but it's the reality. We could have conversations about that for a long time. Gen Z was born with mobile technology in their pocket. A computer, I mean, geez, these phones they're insane. You can get instant access to information, but do you know if the information is good or bad? So there's like all these new problems that we have. Gen Z grew up in an environment where things were a little bit uncertain, right? We had 2008 where we had a really massive recession and massive uncertainty and some major concern and fear among the households. People are losing their houses, people are losing their jobs, and that impacts a generation. We also then move into where we're getting into the COVID world. So I want to take a half a step back. I want to just like level set here on where we're at. We got our 4 generations. They're all in the workplace right now. Baby boomers are your senior leadership. Gen Xers are also middle management to senior leadership. Millennials, senior employees to management. Middle management. Gen Zs are just entering the workplace, right? So they're your newest employees and the most interesting to deal with. Some shifts have happened post-COVID, primarily, and if you're like me, I'm kind of sick of hearing that whole even that phrase, the post-COVID shift, but it is real, and so we have to talk about it. The shifts that we have seen is, number one, the employees were able to take more control over their employment. In the sense of how are they an employee, not control over their employment in the sense of where they work or what their role is, but how are they showing up at work? And some of that was born out of the fact that there was no longer an office where we were all sitting around and I could look at you across the table and have a conversation with you immediately, or I was there watching, if nothing else. And so you might behave a little bit different when you're in the office and a bunch of people are around. You're definitely going to behave different than when you're at home and you're working remotely. I'm not saying one's better or worse, but I'm saying that they're definitely different. So what we had here was a little bit of a shift where the Gen Zs and millennials felt as though they were given an opportunity to maybe reassess how they wanted work to go and what they wanted work to be. And these are things that they had always wanted, but didn't have the space in order to achieve. Gen X and boomers are thinking about how do we get back to where we need to be. And I use the word need on purpose because when I talk to senior leaders at organizations, particularly those that are maybe, in their mid to late 60s, and they're saying like, no, we have to get everybody back to the office. We have to all be back here. We have to, because for them, that's their whole entire work experience has been that. And to them, that's you must have that water cooler conversation. You must have that ride in the elevator. You must have that employee in the break room at lunchtime in order for this thing that we've built to thrive and grow. And so I understand where that pressure is, or that feeling, that emotion of like, oh my gosh, we have to do this. And then you've got some other generations that are thinking about it a little bit differently. So let's talk about what are some of the generations really kind of thinking about right now. Gen Z in particular, and then a little bit of the younger millennials. This is the list of things that are what matters most. John mentioned it earlier. I think it's a really important exercise, more important now than it's been in a really long time. You need to go sit down with your team one by one. And that might be start with the management, have them talk to your team. Or if you got a small enough team, you go talk to your team. You need to sit down and ask them what it is that they want. Like, you really need to say, what's motivating you right now? Where's your head at? What do you feel like you need to be happy? And I know that we don't always feel that that's a conversation we have at work, that work is work and you should come here to earn your paycheck. I'm not here to make you happy. I'm saying it's good information to know. And so as a leader, you want to know this information. It doesn't mean you have to do everything that they say, but again, give them an opportunity to share what would make them happy, what would make them enjoy coming to work, what would make them stick around. Those are hard conversations to have, but important ones. When we look at what motivates Gen Z, this was a study that was done by Gallup on figuring out, and PwC collaborated on this, on what it was this Gen Z generation looking for in work. This is not an order of importance, but this is the top 5 things that bubbled up out of the whole study. You will notice something that's not on this list: money. Money is not one of the number one motivators. You hear a lot of chatter about, oh, fair workplace pay, blah, blah, blah. And to be honest, that's not what's actually motivating the individual Gen Z employee. That's the media talking about things that makes the media get clicks and views. What we're really seeing a lot of here is that the commentary you're hearing out in the media or the political sphere isn't lining up with what the employees are actually saying in the workplace. So first we have to separate from that. So what we're actually seeing is that they want upskilling. The Gen Zs want employers to invest in them learning new skills. The good news is that can come in a lot of ways. Think of like micro boot camps for them to learn new coding skills. Think of little mini courses online for them to learn how to do social media management or leadership, or for them to learn project management, whatever the Excel, like, for heaven's sakes, if you can get your employees to like up their Excel game, they'll save them 50% of their time if they're in Excel all the time just by learning the shortcuts. But they're expecting the employer to be the one driving the ship and investing in that upskilling. I think way back when I was climbing the ranks in the corporate side, that onus was on me. It was my job to go learn. Now employees are expecting that to come from their employer. I will tell you right now from experience, you will not get the same feed. You won't get, when you give somebody $3,000 to upskill them on something, they don't see that as income. So make sure you don't treat it that way, because they're not going to view it that way, which is really hard. Because I remember we had a couple employees where we invested heavily. They came and asked for a big raise, and I was like, well, yeah, but we just spent $8,000 on you to learn all of these things to make you a better employee. That's money out the door for us. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, but now I'm a better employee. So there's just a little disconnect there. And some of these things are hard to swallow, but we need to know this is how they're thinking so that we know how to move forward. Right about now is where somebody out here is listening and they're thinking to themselves, well, screw them. I'm just going to tell them this is just how it is and it's got to be done. You can do that. None of this is to say that you can't. I think of it like swimming in a river. If you want to be successful, it's much easier to swim downstream with the flow than it is to swim upstream. You're going to go a lot farther, a lot faster, and you're going to get somewhere. If you try to swim upstream, it's just going to be more work, and you're going to tire yourself out and burn out. Your organization's the same. Some of these things are going to be shifts for a lot of us, but they're shifts that we have to consider, and we have to figure out how to make them work. Flexible work is a massive one for millennials and Gen Z. Upskilling is not as huge for millennials. Flexible work is huge for millennials and Gen Z. And there's a couple different reasons for this. For millennials, we all have families now. Like, we've got like little kids and like all sorts of stuff going on. And once we've experienced a flexible work environment, and flexible can mean flexible hours, it can mean flexibility in coming into the office or not, like hybrid models. But the opportunity to be able to say, yeah, I've got my son's not in school today, so I need to kind of rework my day around some things that can help make sure that he's got a great day too, because my wife works as well. So it's that sort of flexible work type of environment that we're talking about. Emotional leaders, EQ, emotional intelligence. This means leaders that are in tune with the fact that the human being on the other side has other stuff going on in their world and they may be having a tough time. And this sounds super like fluffy and wishy-washy and woo-woo and why would this matter in the workplace? Gen Z have said very clearly they want leaders who care about them as a person. And I'm not saying you don't care about your employees. All of you, you wouldn't be here if you didn't already care about your teams. But what we're saying here is, does your team know that? And as leaders and managers, man, oftentimes I get in the mode, man. I'm in the zone. We're going, we're doing stuff. Let's tackle this. Let's go here. We're motivating, we're growing. And I didn't take the time to step aside and say, hey, how are you doing? Like, like for real, like how are you okay? Like how are things going? How is life? Anything major happen in your world? And giving them the space to just have that conversation. Um, old school HR would be like, oh my gosh, never. And today we're like, no, look, let's have that personal, real conversation. And so that can go a long way. And that one's free, right? That doesn't cost you anything to do that, other than a little bit of time. But it's a great way to improve retention and really connect with your employees. Diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is a hot topic and a very difficult one. Gen Z has said it. Millennials are on board with this. They want to see more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. They have not defined that clearly. So that leaves us in a little bit of a weird bind when somebody has a motivation, right? So I think of like EQ leaders, that's actually pretty easy. They said, I want my management to care about me as a person. Okay, great. I could think of 15 different ways I can talk to you, show you, lead in ways that show you that I care about you. But when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's all over the board. It's messy. We're not getting any definitions for it. And it is one of those things where we almost lose every single way that we try to approach this as leaders. It's really tough to really nail it in the right way. And that's because every organization is a little different. The world is shifting around us. We have different things that are important at different times to different people. So one person may be, and we have opposing views, right? And let's just call it out. Roe v. Wade. You're going to have some employees that are like, yes, this absolutely is a great thing that this happened. You're going to have some employees that are like, this is the worst thing that could have happened in the entire world. You're going to have some employees in the middle who are like, I really wish we weren't talking about this at all. And I'm not suggesting that you bring that up in the workplace. I would stay away from the hottest of hot topics. You better be aware that they are going to potentially be talked about in the workplace. And I think creating an environment where it's safe for people to feel like they can have different opinions is an important step. And that's a conversation that needs to be had out loud. And that, you know, your team needs to understand that it's okay that other people may have opposing views, but it's not okay to make people feel bad for their views. It's not acceptable for you to think poorly of another team member because they disagree with you on something, because that's what our world is a bunch of people who are trying to do the best they can. More often than not, there's more common ground than not. Some issues are maybe a little bit easier. I think of the Black Lives Matter movement as it rose through prominence in the media, you know, and became a lot more of a talking point that was happening, and employees were asking for leadership to do something. And there was massive conversations happening amongst leaders, which was, well, we're not, you know, father-in-law's senior partner at a large law firm. And he says, we're a law firm. We don't have an opinion on it. That's not our job. We're lawyers. We do the law thing. We're not here to talk about those issues. And I also had other friends who ran companies who were sending out memos to the whole organization in support of everything that's going on from their perspective. So there's a lot of ways to address that. I think you're better to say something, even if it's a little something, than nothing, because silence does speak. And so even if it's a matter of, hey, I know these are challenging times for some people. If you need to talk to somebody, please go reach out to HR or work friend or come talk to your manager. But, you know, I understand there may be emotions and thoughts rising up around these issues, and that's okay to say that. And I think it shows them that you really care. And this is a lot easier if you have kind of an inverted pyramid design. Inverted pyramids, That's basically servant leadership. So my job as a leader is to lead my team and to support them. My job is not to dictate or guide them. So we're going to jump into a couple other practical things. These are all things that you can do and some mindset shifts that you can have. I don't match socks. That's really about limiting your decisions. I don't match socks anymore because it's not a decision I need to make. Here's a handy little way that you can help your team limit decisions. Some of your younger staff don't know how to do this, how to limit the amount of decisions you make or understand what decisions are important and which ones aren't. And so here's just a little chart, and you have urgent and important, not urgent and important, urgent, not important, not urgent, not important. And then you write down, when you got things that come up in work, you write them down and you just put a Post-it on there. And then you just simply say, oh, urgent and important, I should tackle those first. And a lot of stuff will end up in the not urgent, not important area. And those are things that you really don't need to focus on or worry about. And I'll make sure that these slides are available to you all for sure. Contribution networking, which is kind of back to the office. So contributing to each other and each other's growth. This was my marketing agency one year. We won Best Place to Work that year. Super fun. Loved building a team, loved building the culture. Obviously, very young team here. When it comes to getting back into the office, right now, it seems that boomers and Gen X are kind of leaning into going back in the office, with Gen Xers kind of on the fence. Millennials do not want to go back to the office ever at all. So most millennials have said by a mass majority, I'm not interested in going back to the office. Gen Z desperately wants to go back to the office. And part of that is this camaraderie, like what you see in this photo, which is all these people end up kind of becoming friends and they go to happy hour and they hang out. And Gen Z is craving for that. And so as you're thinking about your models, as you're moving back into this flexible work environment, what does it mean? Why does it feel like I'm getting tension around wanting people back in the office? The reason is you've got this huge generation, millennials, which is a huge generation not wanting to go back to the office. And that is causing a lot of tension in the ranks. And so just be aware of that the millennials are not wanting to go back. And part of that is, like, we've got small families. We prefer to work remotely, and we've already got friends. We're not really in that stage anymore in our life. And so definitely important to think about. Always be learning. So this kind of goes to that upskilling side of the fence. And so on the always be learning side, one thing that you could try that worked really well for us was a learning hour. And so once a week, we had an hour from 11 to noon on Thursdays where you were required to learn something outside of your job. So it wasn't supposed to be directly job related. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm working on this project, I need to learn more about that project. It could be anything, but there was 1 hour of learning that we built into the schedule. Just an alternative if you don't want to pay for like upskilling staff, building in time or an expectation that they would be going to learn specifically during this time, set some structure around it, gives them the freedom to feel like they can go learn. And have an opportunity to feel like you're actually investing in them through the time. Fail often and fail fast. This is about choice and autonomy. You need to be setting up your staff so they feel comfortable to fail. That's step one. And in order to be comfortable to fail, they need to understand risk. And understanding risk is important because if a decision isn't that risky, like there's not a major downside to it, if you fail, then it's a great opportunity to try some creative stuff and fail. There are a few decisions that are massive and you really, really don't want to mess them up. And so you need to help make sure that you're building in mechanisms to train your team how to assess risk and then supporting them when they do fail. And so when somebody fails, that's a learning moment, an opportunity for growth, not something that should be viewed as, I can't believe you did that, or, oh man, don't do that again. It should be more like, okay, interesting. Could we have done this differently? What could we learn here? Are there changes that we need to make? Did I do something wrong as the leader that maybe didn't set you up to be successful here? Those are all kind of conversations around understanding how to approach failure and ultimately how to assess risk. The more they understand where the boundaries are and kind of how they can learn from stuff, the more they'll begin to understand the dynamics of risk versus failure and success and decision making. Keep climbing. Accomplishment happens with team. I talked earlier about how everybody was put into groups in K-12 for millennials and Gen Z. This is us climbing Mount Rainier last year. And man, I tell you, when you're roped up with 5 other folks and you're tied together climbing a mountain, and you realize that if one person falls, it's everybody's responsibility to make sure they don't die. Really does give you a sense that that's how people are feeling in the workplace. That's harder to do via Zoom. It's just the reality is it's tough to do that via remote. And so you have to find ways to either build in team-oriented opportunities within a virtual world, or a hybrid moment where people are coming back to do not just team building, but to do things as a team, to tackle problems as a team. That could be goal setting, that could be, planning for success, or whatnot. But you have to build the team in. It's also a great mechanism for motivating people. So instead of you failed and you should not fail because it's bad for your career, it's you failed and that let your team down. Or when you do this, your team isn't able to be as successful, is a better way to put that. And so that really helps kind of lean in on that team-oriented side of the fence that so many folks are needing. Be the coach. Hey, this is all about the coach isn't the one on the field. The coach is the one on the sideline letting their players play. And in order to be a really good coach, you have to know where each player's at. And so this just gets to that comment I made earlier about making sure that you're asking people where they're at, where their head is, and what they have going on in their lives. And so remember to be the coach and don't just step onto the field. And 360 positive impact. So this is about giving back. And this is kind of the last component of this, which is make sure that you build in an opportunity for your team to feel as though they're giving back to the world, because millennials and Gen Zs really, really do find it important to feel the need to give back and to feel like they're making a bigger, broader impact in the world. And so, all right, with that, we are almost right on time. I was leaving 15 minutes for questions. My clock just hit 8:45. So I know we ran through that last part a little fast, but I just kind of wanted to give you some of those chunks. If you really wanted to think about the tactical components of what we were talking about today, a lot of that really came into play with how are we approaching what's motivating our staff, and how are we approaching adding that into our process and procedure, not just having a moment of, oh, we're going to have one conversation about it, but making these things habits and making them become something that you do on a regular basis.
Awesome. We have a couple questions already, and I'm sure we'll get more as we go here. There's a question from Lisa that I feel compelled to tag on to. She's asking, what weighs in more in these generations? Nature, environment, events versus nurture, parents? My first inclination, just to weigh in a little bit, is it both? And they come with the, if you will, the imprint, and then hit the environment, and does it change? That kind of thing. So
yeah, so research is pretty clear. 0 to 5 parents are 100% of really what's influencing the growth of a child. With that becoming in ages 4 and 5, we start to see peers begin to sneak in as becoming important. I think when you say nurture, I do think you want to include peers along with parents, because peers do have a pretty big impact on people as they grow. It's important to remember that external factors impact parents. So, if you were a parent like we were of a little tiny kid, and all of a sudden a pandemic hit, and we had to close down. We were running a boarding school for underserved youth when the pandemic started. So we had to close down a boarding school. We lost our house that we were renting because we were looking to buy in San Diego, and we were renting. And then our landlord said, we need to come back. And then we had to, our whole life just shifted in a month. And so you'd be crazy to think that didn't impact our son, even though we were able to insulate him from all of those things happening externally. They were still hitting us as parents. But as you do begin to get older, and your brain doesn't really fully solidify till you're 25, as far as developing habits, characteristics, and kind of who are you, you got to really go into nature is a massive impact on us as humans. I agree with Ruth that Gen Z is desiring upskilling, not that all generations do value upskilling. I think the important point of this is that Gen Z is expecting it. Yes, I 100% agree. Boomers, Gen X, all of us want upskilling, and all of us love the opportunity to learn and grow. But Gen Z is seeing it as an expectation of that's part of my job, like part of the benefit package.
Well, I wonder, is there a kind of a rub-off effect? Like, is the values that Gen Z coming in with, where that's the expectation, does that then begin to influence other generations where they say, yeah, you know what? I think I want that too.
Like anything, right? If suddenly you see somebody next to you getting something, you kind of like, oh, well, yeah, that's, I mean, I wouldn't mind. Like there's, yes, absolutely. I can see that happening 100%. Which is why I think if you can build it in culturally, it makes it a little easier as opposed to treating it as a one-off. And here's another interesting point is there's something called quiet quitting. And you may not have heard about this yet, but if you're on like TikTok a lot and you follow trends in those worlds, which are very enlightening if you're trying to figure out what's going on with younger generations, there's this massive movement around what they call quiet quitting. Now, when I hear quiet quitting, I think of retiring in your chair, where the people who like just were calling it in, they weren't doing anything. That's not at all what it is. Quiet quitting is that when 5 o'clock hits, they just kind of slip away from the technology and go make dinner, go hang out with their friends, go do whatever they want. And so they're quitting the day. Quiet quitting is about end of day quitting. Like I'm off at 5 o'clock. I used to think when I had staff, the staff should be wanting to show up early, work late, take on every project because they're all on salary and we're all here to grow and put the gas pedal down. That is not the case anymore. Your Gen Zs and millennials are taking note of this and they're jumping in on this trend, are saying, oh, I'm sorry that James quit, but I'm not going to take on James's responsibility without either more money or like I'm not going to do it for free. And that is a new thing because before it used to be everybody chipped in. Somebody left, everybody chipped in. And now it really has moved to this world of, oh, well, I'm sorry that happened to you, employer, right? Oh my gosh, we messed up with the client. We're behind. We need to fix this. I'm going to need you to stay late tonight and tomorrow night to get this done. And they're going, well, you're not paying me for that time. And so even though you might have staff on salary, they are absolutely treating salary as if they're hourly employees. Now, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know. I'm not taking a stance on whether that's good or bad. I'm just simply saying it's reality of what they're thinking. And if they're thinking that, you better be thinking of strategies to counter that sort of emotional feeling. Otherwise, they're going to burn out and leave, or they're just not going to do the work. It could create a lot of tension. It's going to create a lot of tension in your environments for sure.
Yeah. I'll come back to the list there in a second. I wanted to ask you with regard to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You said that the biggest challenge right now is that there's a desire for that, but it's undefined. And there's a lot of solutions kind of be throwing at the wall, but not necessarily hitting, right?
Right.
So I'm wondering, is this an opportunity for leaders to preemptively not throw solutions, but lead the definition?
You can. So here's the thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Number one, it's often misunderstood. I think equity being the biggest misunderstood part of that equation. Inclusion, I think we can all get behind pretty easily. Diversity, I think that's not that hard. We've been talking about diversity for a long time, decades and decades. So that one seems like we kind of got a grasp on what diversity means. But when you look at your environment, a couple good examples. I'm in an entrepreneurs organization in San Diego. We're looking at our chapter makeup and we were realizing like, geez, are we aligned with the population? Like, is our makeup aligned with the population? My marketing agency that I own there was in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we realized, my business partner and I, geez, we're not really that representative of our neighborhood here, like, and so you have to be consciously thinking about that from a diversity perspective. And that can take on a lot of forms. Equity being starting lines versus equal opportunity. So equity and equality are very different things. And then inclusion. How does everybody feel as though they have a seat at the table, a place to be? When you try to lead that conversation with your teams, it's important to probably bring in a facilitator who is more of an expert in leading that conversation. And it's not that you couldn't lead that conversation well with your team, but I always believe that there's a massive opportunity here to have an external source having the lead there as a facilitator. The ADL does a ton of that, the Anti-Defamation League. There's chapters of that everywhere, and they do a ton of DEI stuff and have amazing facilitators, and they're super, super inexpensive. So that would be one organization I would say definitely is worth it. There's also professional organizations that do a lot of this. So there's got to be, in every town that you're in, someone who is out there saying, hey, I can lead a diversity, equity, and inclusion course for you. Just make sure.
I'm also thinking it's an opportunity to kind of collaboratively come up with what do we all want, or what do we, around this, and then create solutions out of that kind of create more engagement or buy-in as well. Yeah.
And that really taps into the whole sharing the opinion. How should this be, and what's our role in this?
Yeah.
Great conversation to have with your team. And you can lead that one yourself, no problem. I think Lisa's got a great point called Life with the Margins, which is the, letting people have their real life as well as work life. And she brought up an interesting point here, which is how do you build water cooler experiences in a virtual environment? So for some of us, my team is 100% virtual. And so some of the stuff that we do is we've done happy hour virtually. Didn't find that to be as popular because it was later in the day. We've done virtual coffee. And so that tends to be a little bit easier and well received during work hours, not before work hours, not asking people to come in early, asking them to take time out of their, maybe after your stand-up meeting in the morning or whatever, doing some coffee, and then having some icebreaker activities, questions that you can ask, what's something somebody, would never know about you, that you don't share often. There's also organizations out there that have set up really, really cool virtual experiences, like games, scavenger hunts, all sorts of cool stuff. And so if you start Googling like virtual team building, there's a ton of organizations that have built some really, really fun, interesting activities that you can do as a team. Again, all of these things need to happen during work hours. And so it's got all the upskilling, all the team activities, all of it's now got to be between 8 to 5 or whatever your work hours are.
Right. It's an investment, and it's not only a desire, let's say, of the workforce, but it seems like the way that you're describing it is an investment that could pay dividends, because one, we're both giving something that's important, and two, we're building the resourcefulness of our teams.
And no one was ever working at their office all 8 hours anyway. Like you are kidding yourself if you thought that when people were clocking in and coming into the desk and sitting down, that they sat there and put in a full 8 hours of time on keys doing work. You might have had a salesperson maybe who was on the phones all day long, but even they notoriously find ways to get out of the office. And so it's always been a part of the world that we've been in. It's just now we need to take and maybe kind of reshift some of those moments in the day, and not even start to try to expect a full 8 hours of actual work, which isn't realistic and normally doesn't happen anyway, and start to say, well, how can we interject other things into the time of the day that are benefiting the office and are benefiting the employee and are benefiting the team and the organization? And we're not really giving up time. We feel like we are, but we're really not. We're trying to recapture time and redirect it in a different way.
And I think the verification of what you just shared was before the pandemic. Gallup did a study and asked 10,000 employees to rate themselves in terms of the level of engagement, and the level of engagement was under 30% as self-reported. So, in an 8-hour day, that means maybe 3 hours out of 8 hours, somebody is productive, right? So that
Yeah.
just goes to underscore exactly what you're saying. So maybe the idea here is by taking them, by recognizing this, I don't know, this opportunity and this desire, and working with it, swimming with the current, like you said, there may be that opportunity to improve that measure from 30% to beyond, right?
And when you ask them what they want, what's motivating you, what are you hoping for, what are you looking for, what's going to make you successful, like what's going to make you happy, the list of things they give you are all opportunities for you to use that list to redirect some of that time. And it's amazing what you'll start to see out of your team, and they'll become more creative, they become more engaged, they become more open and more honest when you invest back into them in that regard.
Right. And I heard you say earlier, you don't have to do all of that, right? You can.
No.
Right.
Yeah, this isn't it's not a Christmas list, and you never got all your Christmas list anyway. It's just, so it's like, like here we are. It's the same thing. Like we're all used to that. At least they feel like they've been heard, and they really do. And that's an important component of this, is making sure that your staff is feeling heard on a personal level, that they're being heard, that things might not be going easy for them in their world, that they're being heard about how things are going at work, and they're being heard about what they want out of their own future. And that's the autonomy piece. Right? You want to talk about retention, that's where it starts to come into play. All of that has to impact retention. Give them an opportunity to feel as though they're a part of what it means to be successful in their own lives.
Yeah. Great stuff, Jabez. Thank you so much. It looks like we've answered the questions. You've given everybody some really great nuggets to take home and to think about and begin experimenting with. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. All right.